January 1327, Parliament assembled on the orders of Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella. The Earl and Isabella, allies and possibly more, had conspired to overthrow Isabella's hapless husband, King Edward II. Now the time had come to formally depose Edward and replace him as king with his and Isabella's son, the 14-year-old prince who would become King Edward III. At that moment, Edward II was being held at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire, where he was held under the watchful eye of Henry, Earl of Lancaster. For Edward, these were bitter and sorrowful times, but he was a proud man and would retain most of his dignity throughout his final months. Efforts began to be made to persuade the king to surrender his crown. The king, of course, still had his supporters, so for Isabella, Mortimer, and those others who wished for Edward to be replaced, it would be best if they could keep matters as secretive as possible. The Bishop of Winchester, John Stratford, who would later be made Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Bishop of Lincoln, Henry Burghurst, travelled to Kenilworth in order to try and persuade Edward of the supposed wisdom of surrendering his crown to his son. The tactics that the bishops employed would be described now as something of a good cop, bad cop routine. Various methods were employed, including promises that Edward would remain in high regard should he surrender the crown, perhaps in higher esteem than at any point during his time as king. The bishops were not adverse to using other, more sinister tactics either, such as emotional blackmail and downright threats. The people of England, the bishops told the king, would enjoy peace and tranquillity once more should he agree to abdicate. However, they warned him darkly, should Edward continue to resist their wishes, then any loyalty to not only Edward would be gone, but also his son and heir could expect to be disinherited too, in favour of some unknown and obscure replacement. Edward II was in dire straits, and he knew it. He must have felt himself being berated, as the bishops spoke both gently and sternly to him, and it proved all too much. As this grim meeting rumbled on, the king let out weary sighs, and at times broke out into sobs. Any hopes Edward had of maintaining resistance against his now inevitable abdication soon disappeared with the arrival of Adam Orleton, Bishop of Hereford, who was a key supporter of Isabella and Mortimer. Upon seeing the arrival of Orleton and his retinue, Edward, all clad in black, in mourning for the kingdom he was about to lose, collapsed in despair. The king was helped to his feet and allowed time to recover, but sympathy was, in otherwise short supply. The Bishop of Hereford spoke in a matter-of-fact way, repeating what the king had already been told. Should he refuse to abdicate voluntarily, he would forfeit the crown for his son. Again, the king became overwhelmed with emotion, but eventually accepted his fate. On behalf of the whole English nobility, a certain William Trussell renounced loyalty to the king, and Sir Thomas Blount, steward of the royal household, broke Edward's staff of office. In Parliament, Edward was formally declared deposed, and in his place, Edward III became the new King of England. For the deposed Edward II, the next 8 months would be full of hardship and insults. It was a spectacular downfall for a misguided, petty, but also somewhat unfortunate king. For the time being, Edward remained at Kenilworth, where it was said he lived a retired life like that of a monk. Although he was clearly grief stricken, Edward bore his plight manfully. He sought the company of his Queen Isabella, who had been so central to Edward's deposition, but she refused point blank to come. so estranged had she become from her husband. To the former king's even greater sorrow, Isabella refused to allow Edward III to visit his father, as the young king remained firmly under the control of his mother and Mortimer, until his dramatic uprising against them in 1330. Edward wept many bitter tears and even appeared to win some sympathy from Lancaster and his supporters. This didn't go unnoticed among Edward's enemies. The Bishop of Hereford began to whisper into Isabella's ear that her husband was entering into an agreement with Lancaster. If this were indeed the case, it would have been bad news for Isabella, but disastrous for Roger Mortimer. Edward, judging by his character, is likely to have forgiven Isabella should he have been able to escape captivity and somehow reclaim the throne. For Mortimer, it would have meant his entire destruction. Mortimer decided that the situation was so serious that the former king must be taken out of Lancaster's custody, and he sent two knights, Thomas Gurney and John Maltravers, to remove Edward from Kenilworth to somewhere more secure. Edward was first taken to Corfe Castle and then to Bristol, but plots predictably emerged that aimed to release him from his captivity. Edward would eventually end up at Berkeley Castle, where he would meet a somewhat mysterious demise. The treatment Edward received from his new jailers was undoubtedly significantly harsher than he had received at Kenilworth. One chronicler accuses Edward's jailers, Maltravers and Gurney, of trying to poison the king, but Edward's physically robust body stood him in good stead. Maltravers and Gurney mocked and taunted Edward, with Gurney accused of placing a crown of thorns on Edward's head whilst they were still at Bristol. However, this story may well be an exaggeration. Gurney and Maltravers may well have jeered and sneered at Edward, but all the while they were afraid that there would be further plots to free Edward. Having left Bristol, Edward's captors stumbled on a small stream. Forcing Edward to sit upon a small molehill, they shaved his beard off using some water from the stream, hoping to decrease the chances of detection by Edward's supporters. This tale was relayed by one William Bishop, who bore witness to these strange events. Finally, Edward was shut up at Berkeley as a wretched prisoner. Mortimer, Isabella, and their supporters, most prominent amongst them the Bishop of Hereford, lived in fear that Edward should somehow escape, and they now made it plain to Gurney and Maltravers that the time had come for Edward to be removed for good. Famously, the story goes that King Edward was first suffocated with cushions before a red hot iron was inserted into his anus, though that is likely to have been nothing more than an embellishment of what actually happened. However, Edward II did die, and his end almost certainly came at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, although some historians do question this. There are also question marks over how Edward was treated by his captors in his final weeks. Some chronicles say that Edward was tortured cruelly, although there is some evidence to contradict that. Either way, Edward II's death had been entirely avoidable. He had made too many enemies, and the most dangerous of them had been his own queen.